So glad we could be together as we wrap up our study of 2 Kings, be in chapter 24 and 25 today. So I'll call this 4 Rays of Hope. I'm going to sort of bring what we read here together and make 4 points after we have a chance to just kind of walk through it I won't be able to read it all, as has been the case through most of 2 Kings. But you will remember, I think most of you, that they've thrown this John Stott quote up on the screen a couple times, and I thought it really made for a good ending as well. History is not a random series of meaningless events, but rather a succession of periods and happenings which are under the sovereign rule of God, who is the God of history. And so as we've gone through 1 and 2 Kings, here's the overview. I think you've seen this before, and as this is our last study in the 2 books, I think it'd be good to summarize it again. We saw the wisdom and folly of King Solomon, the first 11 chapters of 1 Kings. We saw the kingdoms in chaos as the kingdom was torn in two in chapters 12 and 16 of 1 Kings. Chapter 17 through 2 Kings chapter 13, read about these prophets, Elijah and Elisha, really how God moved powerfully through them, and great study there. And then chapters 14 through 17 of 2 Kings have been the story of the decline of Israel, which is the northern kingdom. Of course, the 10 tribes up there. In 722 BC, Assyria dismantles the northern kingdom entirely. And so we pick up, or you picked up already in chapters 18, and we'll finish up today in chapters 24 and 25 with the story of the decline of Judah, which is in the south, the southern kingdom. And there you have already studied Josiah, I think just a couple chapters ago, is the one really bright spot in the line of kings in Judah. There were 20 kings in Judah and 19 in the northern kingdom, so you have a total of 39 kings as you study through 1 and 2 Kings. But Josiah was a pretty good one. I mean, none of these kings are perfect, but they all point to our need for a greater king and a better king. And certainly we'll continue to remind ourselves that we find that greater king in the person and work of Jesus. But Josiah, pretty good king. Jehoahaz, son of Josiah, reigned approximately from 609, and he's the 17th of the 20 kings. And we'll read today about Eliakim, Jehoiakim. That's a person who has 2 names, and there are several of these kings that have multiple names. And I don't know if it's been confusing to you, all these different names, some of which sound a lot alike. But you have to really pay attention, which is difficult for a short attention span guy like me to do, probably for some of you as well. But Eliakim, Jehoiakim, same person, and reigned from 609 to 598 BC. And remember, the numbers go down as you come toward us in time. He's the 18th king of Judah. Then Jehoiachin, who is also called Jeconiah and Coniah, reigned approximately 598, 597. He's the 19th king. Then the last one is Mattaniah, who's also called Zedekiah. You'll see his name changed in this chapter we'll read today. He's the last of the kings that we'll read about from Judah. And then up on the screen there, or on the slide that you can see if you're listening online, conquest of Judah by the Babylonians really began in 597 BCE, but it runs all the way down till the sort of ultimate destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in 586. And then you'll have the beginning of the return of the Jewish people to Jerusalem starting in 538 and under Cyrus the Persian, who conquers the Babylonians. And so you see these kingdoms, these different nations and kingdoms that sort of rolling over top of one another, and God is really steering and directing the whole thing, and he returns some of his people to Jerusalem starting in 538, and that there begin sort of 3 or 4 waves of returns of Jewish people to ultimately rebuild the Jewish temple in 516. So look at chapter 24, 2 Kings, verse 1. In those days, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up, and Jehoiakim became his servant for 3 years. So Jehoiakim, when he's king in Judah, is going to be a vassal to Nebuchadnezzar for 3 years. But then he's going to kind of wake up sometime after 3 years and go, I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm not going to be a vassal to Nebuchadnezzar. And then in verse 2, it says, the Lord sent against him bands of Chaldeans, those are Babylonians, bands of Syrians, bands of Moabites, and bands of the Ammonites. And so this is literally the first battle of the bands, that we have. And I don't know if that's where we get that whole term from or not, but it is a battle of the bands. But notice that it says that the Lord sent them to come up against Jehoiakim and the people of Judah. And then in the middle of verse 2, so he, meaning the Lord, sent them against Judah to destroy it according to the word of the Lord, which he had spoken through his servants, the prophets. Surely at the command of the Lord, it came upon Judah to remove them from his sight because of the sins of Manasseh, according to all that he had done. So it's not just arbitrary. God's not being cranky. God's wrath, God's discipline is always his settled opposition to all that is evil. And all that is evil in a biblical viewpoint is actually defined by us wanting to fight against God, to be at odds with God. And so this comes at the command of the Lord and according to all that he had done, but it's because of the sins of Judah. And so 605 BC is this Battle of Carchemish. It's very well known in ancient Near Eastern history. And it really was the Egyptians versus the Babylonians. And you read about it as well in 2 Chronicles chapter 35. If you're interested in all of that, you'll have to do that on your own and pursue some of that. But the Lord would not forgive them, we're told at the end of verse 4 there in chapter 24. And that just reminds us, again, God's grace. You can't outrun his grace, but we must also preach the reality that his patience isn't infinite. There comes a point where he goes, these folks are so self-destructive, or these folks are so sinful that I have to draw a line. And so he draws a line and begins to allow them to live their lives as if God didn't matter. And that's exactly what sin is, living our lives as if God doesn't matter. So Jehoiachin reigns. We'll drop down a few verses there. He's the 19th of the 20 kings. He was 18 years of age. Think about that when you become king. Verse 8 tells us. He reigned for how long? 3 months. That's it. We get his mother's name there. And then we get that summary in verse 9 of chapter 24. He did evil in the sight of the Lord. And that's the same summary that we've seen back in chapter 23, for instance, verse 32. He did evil in the sight of the Lord, as they were talking about Jehoahaz. And that's a summary that continues through, as you read throughout 1st and 2nd Kings, you find that being the summary. The summary of the effectiveness of the kings isn't about their sort of political policies. It's about their spiritual disposition. And so the Bible is a record of the spiritual disposition of these kings toward Yahweh and their total disregard of Yahweh. And that's how a king is measured, whether the king is good or bad from a biblical standpoint. So Jehoiakim slept with his fathers, and then Jehoiachin, his son, comes in and takes his place. Verse 6 tells us Jehoiachin was 18, we're told in verse 8. And basically his 3 months is between 598 and 597 BC. And he's the one that's also known as Jeconiah and Coniah, and as if we needed more help to be confused about some of these names, right? Well, the servants of Nebuchadnezzar, verse 16 says, king of Babylon, went up to Jerusalem and began to siege Jerusalem, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. So there's been lots of warfare. There's been lots of sieging, but this is going to be one of those times we're now leaning toward the sort of ultimate destruction of Jerusalem and of the temple itself. And verse 13 tells us that Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, came to the, or verse 11 says, came to the city while his servants were besieging it. And Jehoiachin, the king of Judah, went out to the king of Babylon, he and his mother and his servants, his captains and officials. And the king of Babylon took him captive in the 8th year of his reign. And he carried out from there all the treasures of the house of the Lord, the treasures of the king's house, cut them in pieces, all the vessels of gold which Solomon, king of Israel, had made in the temple of the Lord, just as the Lord had said. And whoever our writer is will over and over and over again, and you roll right past him if you don't, again, pay attention to it. But when he makes a comment like, just as the Lord had said, you're being reminded that God is faithful to both his promises and his warnings. And his plans and purposes will come about just as he had said. Then they, verse 14, led away into exile all Jerusalem and all the captains, all the mighty men of valor, 10,000 captives, all the craftsmen, all the smiths. None remained except the poorest people of the land. So they're ravaging Jerusalem and Judah. They're taking away all of the people that seem to be sort of the brightest and best, if you will, and leaving behind those who could be no threat to Babylon whatsoever. They're the poorest, least educated, least skilled, and all that sort of thing. And of course, isn't it just like God to preserve a remnant, and sometimes preserve that remnant from the most unlikely group of people that, in worldly terms, that people might imagine, right? All the men of valor, verse 16, 7,000 of them, the craftsmen, smiths, so all the people that could make things. 1,000, all strong and fit for war. So they're all being carried away. We will. You read the rest of your Old Testament, and you'll know that Daniel, that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are among them. So these books overlap, and we find overlap with the prophet Ezekiel, the prophet Jeremiah. We find an overlap in the big story when they start returning to Jerusalem. We also find overlap with Ezra, Nehemiah, that sort of thing as well. So verse 17 of chapter 24, the king of Babylon made his uncle Mattaniah king in his place and changed his name to Zedekiah. So you see these names are being changed. You see on the slide there, Mattaniah is also Zedekiah, reigned approximately 597 to 586. And this is the last named king that we'll have for Judah. Verse 19, the summary. He did evil in the sight of the Lord, according to all that Jehoiakim had done. So they learn from their parents. Good word to parents, to remind parents to pass along a heritage, a spiritual heritage, some love for the Lord. Verse 1 of chapter 25. This is our last chapter in 2 Kings. It came about in the 9th year of his reign, on the 10th day of the 10th month, that Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came, he and all his army, against Jerusalem, camped about it, built a siege wall all around. The city was under siege until the 11th year of King Zedekiah. That's an 18-month siege. So again, we read verses pretty fast, and we think it was just a sort of flip of a switch, but really it's a slow fade. You know, that something, it takes 18 months to lay siege to this city, even though a lot of people have been carried away that might have defended it, that sort of thing. Notice the detail of the dating of this thing. It's the 9th year of the 10th day of the 10th month. Very specific. I like that about our Bible, that it, often, not always, but often gives us that kind of specificity. The city was broken into, verse 4, all the men of war fled by night. By the way, the ones that were there and attempted to put up some opposition, and they fled by the king's garden through the Chaldeans were all around the city, and they went by way of the Arabah. Now, the Arabah is another term for the Jordan Valley. It's if you've been to Jerusalem, you know that you can go. There's a highway that goes to, as you move east, goes to Jericho, down into the desert area. What's fascinating to me is that here is the way they're going to leave, and here is the way they actually entered the promised land, all the way back in the book of Joshua. And it's through the same, the Lord led them into the promised land right around Jericho. That was their first battle, remember? And now as and it's as if one who's reading all of history, if you can connect those dots, it's as if you can see it's the Lord that brought them in. It's the Lord that gave them the land. And sadly, they turned their backs on the Lord. And so it's the Lord that's actually directing their departure as part of their discipline in all of that. So let me jump down to verse 8. On the 7th day of the 5th month, again, look at the detail, which was 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, that's one of Nebuchadnezzar's officers, a servant of the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem, and he burned the house of the Lord, the king's house. This is very sad, actually. And all the houses of Jerusalem, all the great houses he burned with fire. And all the army of the Chaldeans, another way of saying Babylonians, who were with the captain of the guard, broke down the walls around Jerusalem. And I hear, when you compare this with other books of the Old Testament, I hear the prophet Jeremiah, who wrote the book of Lamentations, how desolate is the city that once was full of life. And as he's bemoaning the outcome here, you can understand that. Think about modern day stories like that when we read about nations that get torn apart, that sort of thing. Verse 12, but the captain of the guard left some of the poorest of the land to be vine dressers and plowmen. So interesting, there's always this little remnant that is left, isn't it? Now there's a great bit of detail there, which we're going to skip over and jump to verse 22. As far as the people who were left in the land of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had left, he appointed Gedaliah, the son of Ahikam, the son of Shaphan, over them. Notice the son ofs. When those things are given to us, that's the same kind of detail we're getting about a calendar. Now we're getting it about somebody's lineage. So that if there happened to be another guy named Gedaliah back in history, we can make sure that we have the right Gedaliah because he's the son of Ahikam, and who was the son of Shaphan over them. And when all the captains of the forces, they and their men, heard that the king of Babylon had appointed Gedaliah governor, they came to Gedaliah at Mizpah, namely Ishmael, the son of Nethaniah, and Johanan, the son of Kareah, and Sarai, the son of Tanhumeth, and Netophathite, and Jaazaniah, the son of the Maacathite, they and their men. Gedaliah swore to them, though, and their men, and said to them, do not be afraid of the servants of Chaldeans. Live in the land, serve the king of Babylon, and it will be well with you. But, verse 25 says, about the 7th month, Ishmael, the son of Nethaniah, and who's the son of Elishama of the royal family, came with 10 men and struck Gedaliah down so that he died along with the Jews and the Chaldeans who were with him at Mizpah. Then all the people, both small and great, the captains of the forces, arose and went to Egypt, for they were afraid of the Chaldeans. So now there's this kind of abandonment to Egypt, which is south. And Egypt, Pharaoh Necho and some of those who had over the years been warring against the Babylonians. And there have been, Israel tends to be, as you look through ancient Near East history, you just keep seeing Israel get run over top of by a lot of these larger forces. And yet Israel as well has its bright spot moments. When David was king, when Solomon was king, there was warfare, that's true. But Israel was quite well protected and walking with the Lord in those days a little bit more. Verse 27 through 30 are really the way we close out the book, and I do want to read these. Came about in the 37th year of the exile of Jehoiachin, king of Judah, in the 12th month, on the 27th day of the month, that evil Merodach, king of Babylon, and just think if your name is evil, your first name is evil, I guess, your last name is Merodach, king of Babylon. He's the successor of Nebuchadnezzar too. Evil Merodach, king of Babylon, in the year that he became king, released Jehoiachin. This is a real turn, a real shift in the flow of history. It seems like everything's going down the drain. And look, this guy releases Jehoiachin, king of Judah, from prison, and he spoke kindly to him and set his throne above the throne of the kings who were with him in Babylon. And Jehoiachin changed his prison clothes, had his meals in the king's presence regularly all the days of his life. Isn't that amazing? For his allowance, a regular allowance was given him by the king, a portion for each day, all the days of his life. And that's the end, my friends, of the text of 2 Kings. What we just read, by the way, here's a photo, it'll be up on the slides, of a clay tablet presently on display in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, Germany. The fragment was recovered in the early 20th century near the Ishtar Gate, and it's been dated back to the 6th century BCE, gives instructions in the ancient Akkadian language for the rations set aside for the king of Judah named Jehoiachin and 5 of his sons. Our Bible is set in space-time history. And it's corroborated by archaeological evidence like this all along the way. And if something seems a mystery, I always say, just give archaeology a little while to catch up. And there are some just amazing things that are being found over in the area of the Bible, or the land of the Bible. So again, I think our overall theme is going to be, even in our darkest moments, as we see in verses 27 through 30, there comes the hand of God steering history, changing hearts. And somebody named Evil Merodach decides to take the last king, that he happens to have in prison, and to change things. So I'll give you 4 points here, and I'll throw them all up here. 4, I'll call them rays of hope. The sovereignty of God over human history is evident as we've gone through this text. The certainty of God's righteous judgment is on display as we've gone through these two books as well. And that's a good thing. I want to, when I say that, I hope you have heard us say upstairs in our Bible studies or at other times that it's really a good thing that there's a righteous judge who's ultimately in charge. And if you want justice, then you want somebody righteous being the one to determine what is right and what is wrong and what deserves judgment and what does not deserve judgment. But overall, we have the sovereignty of God over all of human history, the certainty of God's righteous judgment. Thirdly, the enduring hope of God's amazing grace. And I would suggest to you that verses 27 through 30 there at the end of chapter 25 really do open up that. As we see the turn happen there, it foreshadows the rest of the flow of redemption history and what God, who's still in charge of all of redemption history, intends to do by sending a greater king who's going to open up the way for us to live in a greater kingdom. So that's actually my fourth ray of hope there. So what surprising and amazing grace this God of the Bible offers to us and walks us even through these dark moments of human history where his judgment is on display. And he does that to remind us that he's very serious and takes sin very seriously. He doesn't just sweep it under the rug. And I think we need to be reminded of that ourselves. We tend to live in a day and age that's quite permissive, that's quite, God wouldn't want me to be unhappy. And I think what the Bible keeps saying is that your greatest happiness is actually found in you living in right relationship with God, not just having a bunch of stuff, not just not you just taking the reins yourself and trying to create your own reality or your own recreate yourself and redefine yourself the way you want to define yourself. No, that's a burden too great for any of us to bear. We need to trust and hope and lean on, trust and hope in our Creator God, and I'm so glad that we can do that. Lewis said from Mere Christianity, what we call human history: money, poverty, ambition, war, prostitution, classes, empire, slavery. It's the long, terrible story of man trying to find something other than God, which will make him happy. And I think that's an astute observation about humanity. And you could say that at virtually any point in the space-time continuum, you know what I mean? Down through human history. You could stop and say that about World War II, which is when Lewis is writing Mere Christianity, facing the horrors of Nazi Germany on the march and all that sort of thing. Or you could say that right now in our own time as well, that if we're looking to something other than God to make ourselves happy, we're not going to find it. It's not going to be a lasting kind of happiness. We're going to find ourselves chronically dissatisfied and longing for more. And we'll turn to all kinds of temporal things that we think we can control, things like money, poverty, money, actually wealth, and its opposite, poverty, and ambition, war, prostitution, classes, empires, and all of that. So it's important for us to know we can't find our greatest joy in any of those things. Secondly, John Ortberg, in Soul Keeping, said, I had always thought that a lost soul referred to the soul's destination, not to its condition. And what he's saying is it's a condition. And I think he's right. The condition of a lost soul, that's the real problem. The Lord wants to find, or wants us to be found, rather, in him. And finally, I want to close with this little quote from Keller. Most people want Jesus as a consultant rather than a king. But he doesn't come that way. He comes as a king, and really what we need is a king. If you've read C.S. Lewis's The Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe, you know that Mr. Beaver, one of the characters in the storyline, tells Susan and Lucy about Aslan. The girls seek some reassurances about Aslan because Lucy says, is he a man? And Mr. Beaver says, is he a man? Certainly not. I tell you, he's the king of the wood, the son of the great emperor beyond the sea. Don't you know he's the king of beasts? Aslan is a lion, the great lion. And Susan says, I thought he was a man. Is he quite safe? I shall feel rather nervous about meeting a lion. And Mrs. Beaver says, that you will, dearie. Make no mistake. If there's anyone who can appear before Aslan without their knees knocking, they're either braver than most or else silly. Lucy says, then he isn't safe? And Mr. Beaver says, safe? Don't you hear what Mrs. Beaver has told you? Who said anything about safe? Of course he isn't safe, but he is good. He's the king, I tell you.